This podcast is brought to you by the North Dakota Petroleum Foundation. From heating our homes and powering our vehicles to cell phones, clothing, and medical equipment, oil and natural gas makes everyday life better. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities. Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org. Welcome to Plain Talk Live. I'm your host, Rob Port. You know, it's interesting. We talk about politics all the time. And the interesting thing about that is most of the debate centers around policy. But process is often as important as policy. And by that, I mean some of the very fundamental ways in which our government is organized. We have three separate and co-equal branches of government, as anybody who's ever taken a civics class knows. And those different branches of government have very specific and very distinct powers. And sometimes we struggle when different branches of government maybe get out of that lane a little bit. Because at the end of the day, we all want to have effective policy, but also our government is structured that way for a lot of very specific reasons. In the state of North Dakota, we actually had one of the vetoes issued by Governor Doug Burgum this last session that was ultimately overridden by the legislature, was of a bill that put limits on the ability of what's called the Emergency Commission to appropriate funds. Now, the Emergency Commission's been around for a long time. It's made up of the governor, the Secretary of State, the House and Senate majority leaders, and the chairs of the House and Senate Appropriations Committees. So essentially what happens is during the interim, sometimes some federal money comes in or something that the legislature hasn't necessarily appropriated for, and they make a decision on appropriating that money, and then that decision goes to the budget section, which is kind of a very unique committee that's made up basically of the members of the House and Senate Appropriations Committees. It goes to that committee. But they don't get to make any changes. They just get to give it how it was before, is they just got to give it a thumbs up, thumbs down. It was almost kind of interesting because the governor sits over a committee that essentially legislates, writes appropriations for federal money, and then the legislative committee gets what is effectively a veto. So kind of working backwards from where things are traditionally supposed to work. So that's interesting. But the legislature, they passed that bill and they changed. They put a cap. And they said, anything that's over anything that's cumulatively over $50 million, we have to bring the full legislature in. Now, what prompted this is the legislature, during the pandemic, North Dakota got like $1 billion in federal money, which is an unprecedented situation. I mean, we'd never had that happen before. The emergency, there was no special session called. I thought that they should have come into a special session. I know some other lawmakers called for that. But the legislative leadership said we didn't need one, maybe because they get seats on the Emergency Commission. Governor Burgum said he wasn't going to call the legislature into session. Instead, the executive committee just appropriated it. Well, now the legislature has this new law, and, well, some lawmakers don't want to follow it. They think it may have went too far because about the law went into effect in April, and about 2 or 3 weeks after it went into law, we had already passed the cap. And remember, we're still on the last biennium that ends June 30th, so in about 2 weeks here. Within like 2 or 3 weeks, they'd already passed the limit, and there was the possibility of needing a special session. So the legislature saying, maybe we made a mistake in this bill that we passed, and then we overrode Governor Doug Burgum's veto. So we're going to talk with former Governor Ed Schafer about this, who knows a thing or two about separation of powers. Governor, how you doing?
I'm well. Good morning or good afternoon, Rob. It's great to be with you.
Good afternoon. Let's. What do you make of this situation with the Emergency Commission and the legislature and everything? What are you seeing?
Well, as you walk through it and talk through it here, just a minute ago, I had all kinds of thoughts. It's like there's all kinds of things tied up in here, and I think the first thing to mention is. You talked about policy and the policy-making branch of the legislature, which is appropriate. The interesting thing is culture overtakes policy all the time. So you can put all the policy you want out there, but if the culture of the organization or the culture of the whole is such to where it doesn't work. The culture is going to win. And in this case, the reason I mention that is because I believe the culture in the Capitol today, the culture in the building the culture between the executive and the legislative branch is at odds. I think they're kind of poking each other. They're trying to figure out who gets to have the power here, who gets to have the say, who gets to make the decisions. All those are going on, and they've gotten into this kind of cultural war between the executive and the legislative branch, and they're not thinking about the people. They're not thinking about the state. I mean, I'm saying that as a blanket statement, Rob. Of course, they think about the people, but when they're making decisions, they're not sitting there saying, "Well, this is what's right" or "This is what's wrong." They're saying, "I want to do this because it bests the governor" or something. So I think that's the first problem we have up there. Because as you define the emergency commission, the things on the emergency commission, are really meant to be for cases where unanticipated expenditures need to be made in the interim period. So, for instance, if we have a really bad winter and they spend all of the snow removal money at the Capitol in the first month, you have all kinds of time that you're going to need some dough. So they go in front of the emergency commission. They say, okay, we'll shore up the budget, and they have some budget dollars available. So it's an emergency situation. What happened this time, of course, is the dollars got big, but the other thing is the emergency lasted a long time. So it wasn't like, and I think we talked about this on your show before. I mean, and they had the flood comes, the flood goes away, the emergency goes away with the flood, and you shift from emergency to flood recovery. And then, then you're not having this emergency commission situation anymore. So I think that's an issue. The length and depth of this, quote, emergency that we had with the virus has made it difficult operationally between the two branches of government, because you had big dollars coming in. You had the legislature that's saying, gee, maybe we should have the ability to spend those. And you had the governor saying, hey, we got to spend them in the education. You guys have already developed a policy for education. We're just putting dollars in to follow that same policy. Or, as an example, but there are any other agency where the dollars got put, the highway department or the health department for sure. The policy is already in place, Rob. The policy's there. All you're talking about is putting money into the policy that the legislature's already put forward. So I'm not sure where that, emergency powers should lie. But I think there's certainly room for discussion about where the parameters are around that thing.
Well, let's get into that a little bit, because I think you're right. Obviously, the legislature is a big committee, and like committees, they work relatively slowly. Now in North Dakota, it's always a bit of a race, figurative, relative to maybe the way some other legislative bodies, because they only have 80 days, right? So they come into session, and they have usually thousands of bills and resolutions that they have to make it through, and it becomes a bit of a foot race. But they're a big old committee, and they don't necessarily do their work very quickly. So if we're in an emergent situation, like, I don't know, we have a wildfire, and the executive branch needs to respond to that, and maybe there's people that need relief, maybe some of our first responders need additional funding or something. It makes absolute sense for the legislature to delegate a certain amount of authority to the executive branch, and so the emergency branch can respond to what are truly emergent situations. I think, like you said, the problem is the pandemic went on. I mean, in some ways, it's still with us. I mean, the emergency commission we're still getting federal money, right? And we're still making decisions about, what we're going to be doing with federal money. So this becomes a difficult issue. Where are the limits? So this bill that we're talking about specifically, it was the prime sponsor on it was Senator David Hogue, Republican from Minot. And I actually spoke with him today. When he originally wrote the bill, he had pinned the limit at $100 million cumulatively through a 2-year cycle, a biennium. By the time it emerged from the legislature, that had been cut down to $50 million. He candidly told me he thought that was down too low. He would be open to moving that limit back up. But do you think that's really the issue, Ed? Is it's a matter of scope, like how far this goes?
Well, it could be. I don't know. Being from the executive branch, I was like, need the legislative
Yeah.
branch interfering.
Well, when I was
stuff.
talking to Hogue, you were calling me, and I was
Yeah.
like, well, Ed's calling me on the other line, and I know how he's going to feel about this, former governor.
Yeah. but the reality is, if you want to use this situation as an example, we've gone through a long period of time, and we have, as you mentioned, still have federal dollars coming in, and so and we aren't operating in an emergency crunch situation anymore. Now it's really coming in on those dollars to allocate those dollars and where they go. Now, the legislature knew these dollars were coming in. This isn't a surprise that we have federal dollars coming in. They knew, that we had the option of federal dollars coming in as well. And they could have set up the system to receive those federal dollars and allocate them in the way that they saw fit during the legislative session, but they didn't. So now we have the deal where we'll let instead of let us do our work here and figure out if dollars come in, where they go. Let's just throw it to the Emergency Commission, but let's put limits on the Emergency Commission about what they can do. I'm not sure that's right, because as you mentioned, how do you decide where it is? Is it 50 million? Is it 100 million? Is it 150 million? You don't know what the dollars are. So really, in my opinion, the legislature should sit up a situation where the Emergency Commission operates under the parameters of an emergency. And this isn't about the governor or the executive branch have an authority to do so. The legislature has dished off the authority to an emergency commission, which is made up of the legislative branch and the executive branch. So it's both of them who are making this decision. And you're not giving power to the government, to the governor. You are taking power into the emergency commission, and they're the ones that say yes or no on the expenditures of these emergency dollars. So I think the best thing, in my opinion, the best thing to do is not to set some kind of limits to it or put it, but let's define emergency, and maybe instead of emergency commission for dollars over that don't affect increased in budgeted and policy wise budget already. In other words, I'm rambling around here, but my point is this. Most things that come in front of the Emergency Commission are because of a budget issue with policies that are already in place, with agencies that are already in place, with authorities already in place. So it's just saying, hey, we spent too much money over here and we need some. Or we got some fines, that came in and we want to spend them on a new officer or whatever. So, they're real honest, quote, emergency situations. Okay, so how do you decide where those emergency situations are and which are mere allocation of dollars that aren't fit into the thing already? And I would rather have. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, maybe that's the problem. Maybe what we're trying to do, because the COVID situation was unique, right? I mean, it's a once in a century pandemic. We have a mechanism through which the legislature can come in and for special circumstances, the full legislature, if we need it. The governor can call them, or now if they have, some of their 80 legislative days, this is a more recent development, but the legislature could call themselves back into session to use up what's remaining of the Constitution allots them 80 days every 2-year cycle. So, maybe instead of trying to craft permanent policy to address what was a very unusual situation, which is the state of North Dakota getting more than $1 billion in federal funding responding to a pandemic, maybe they should have just done a special session last year and included the full legislature in this. I feel like they could have done that. Maybe that was the solution, is they should have treated it as it was last year, which is a very unique situation, and call the full legislature in, but just leave the long-standing policy about the Emergency Commission alone. I really think they made a mistake. And this is what frustrates me about the legislatures. It seems like they want to have their cake and eat it too. We've come through at the beginning of Governor Burgum's administration. We had the legislature, kind of thumping their chests about, they ended up with a lawsuit that went to the state Supreme Court over some of these very same separation of powers issues. They were talking mostly about the budget section committee. We came through the 2020 election cycle where a lot of lawmakers were very upset that Governor Burgum, was involved in legislative races. He raised money, he spent his own money in a lot of these legislative races, to sort of promote his own candidates. There were lawmakers who were, talking about separation of powers issue last year during the pandemic. When we were dealing with a lot of this, when people such as myself were calling for a special session, say there's $1 billion here. Hey, legislature, we probably need a special session to engage on some of this stuff. Legislative leaders said, no, we don't. House Majority Leader Chet Pollard, Senate Majority Leader Rich Wardner said, no, we don't need this stuff. Then we come to the session, and now all of a sudden it's, well, we got to put all these. It's pick a lane. I mean, what do you want? I feel like if the legislature had stood up and said, hey, call us into special session so that we can address this $1 billion, this very unusual situation, and help appropriate some of that, we could have avoided a lot of this. But they didn't do it. And it leaves it just absolutely confused. What do you want? Do you want to be engaged? Do you not want to be engaged?
Rob, this is why I opened our comments today about the culture that's going on up there. The culture is, how do we get it away from the governor, or in the governor's standpoint, how do we get it away from the legislature? So that battle is going on up there all the time. So you can't satisfy that battle, right? If you give, one of them's going to give too much, one of them's not going to get enough. I mean, there's just never, you can't solve that if that is the culture. You're always going to have the political battles of who's in charge here. But if the culture is, this is how we operate, how do you fix that? How do you do that? And I think this is a perfect manifestation of that culture, because, as you said, call us into session. No, we don't want to be called into a session. Whatever.
Do you feel like
you can't satisfy that?
Sometimes it seems like the executive and legislative branches are engaged in a game of gotcha, where they're both kind of out to gotcha the other one. And I don't have a problem with tension between, as you mentioned, with tension between the executive branch and the legislative branch. That's baked into the system. That's supposed to be there, right? We have the separation of powers. We break that power up for reasons, because we don't want too much of it consolidated in one place, and that creates tension and friction as each branch of government, either tries to protect their own powers or maybe tries to expand their powers. That push and pull is normal, and it's fine. What I'm worried about, though, is the legislature. I mean, some of this point scoring on one another. The goal should be, let's govern the state effectively. And the legislature's got to be a part of that. The executive branch has to be a part of that. The courts, when it's appropriate, have to be a part of that. And it seems like that's getting lost in the shuffle here.
I believe it is, and it's something that we can see, and I believe you can directly point it out. The real situation is, how do you solve the problem? Now, the legislature can call themselves in. Why don't they? Why didn't they? They say, oh, gee, we only have 4 days. Well, you know how the legislature works. They sit up there, they stop the clock. They don't call themselves into session.
Right.
There's all kinds. That 4 days could be 2 weeks.
That 4 days, that's only 4 gavelled in days. They can meet.
Exactly.
They could show up and meet in their various committees in that. The only time it counts against the days is if they meet essentially as the full body and gavel in, to where the full body, they can vote and pass laws. That's I mean, so those 4 days are not as much of a limit, maybe, especially if you're very focused on a particular set of issues. They can really get a lot done in those 4 days that they put their mind to it. So you're right, they could have called themselves back into session, and they didn't. And I think it's a pertinent question. If you're going to go so far as to override the governor's veto and draw your line on this, why didn't you do more last year? And that really, really frustrated me when it was all this resistance to simultaneously hear them, sort of grandstanding on the power of the legislature. And I of the two people participating in this conversation, I'm probably the one that's more on the legislature side than you are, right? Generally, I think obviously I know you think the legislature is important too, but I probably think they're more important than you are, than you do, and yet I'm the one saying here, fellas, you can't have it both ways, and sometimes honestly it could come off. I got the feeling during the pandemic is they didn't want to be on the hook, right? Having to make decisions in an emergency situation is hard, and it can be a little scary, and you can maybe make the wrong decisions for which, there could be consequences. And I think some of it was they just didn't want to be in session and maybe make the wrong decisions and be on the hook for it. I think, I don't want to say all the lawmakers felt that way. I think some of them did.
Well, there is always that element. Let's gripe about what needs to be done, but then we don't do anything to do what needs to be done. It's one of the tenets we had in the governor's office when I was there was solve the problem. How do you solve this problem? You don't solve this problem by trying to cut the legs out from underneath the governor. You don't solve the problem by talking about it in the media and not calling yourselves into session. The reality is you can solve this if you want to. They could have dealt with this when they were sitting in the legislative session. They could deal with it right now with their ability to call a session.
Yeah, they have like 4 days left.
And the reality is the governor could deal with it too. The governor could call them into special session. So maybe the thing to do here, if we really want to think about solving the problem, maybe the thing to do here is say, under what circumstances can we force make the governor call a special session? The governor doesn't have to call a special session. The governor can call a special session, but maybe there are some parameters here that, if the emergency goes longer than 6 months, or maybe there's a way.
Well, they actually did something like that, where if the emergency goes on for a certain amount of time,
right?
The governor has to either wrap the emergency up, like end his order or whatever that he did, or call the legislature into session. It's interesting stuff. It's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about is the state investment board. Now, I know for people, the state investment board oversees the state's investments. Most of those investments are the biggest ones are pension plans for the state's teachers, for the state's public workers. There's some trust investments that are involved there as well. And then a big one that's obviously in the news a lot is the legacy fund. Now, we've seen some controversy in recent weeks where the state investment board has been accused, and I'm one of the critics who's leveling this, but the Forum editorial board made this criticism as well, has accused them of being essentially rubber stamps for their consultant. They have a big consultant, Callan, based out of I think their headquarters is in San Francisco, California. There's a perception that they're just kind of doing whatever Callan tells them to do. And then there's also some revelations where Callan has they have like these, they have like a foundation that does like training seminars or something. And so other money managers pay to go to these training seminars. And it just so happens that most of the companies with the legacy fund specifically, I think there's like 15 companies, and like 12 to 13 of them have all, paid Callan money, and we don't know how much money because Callan has requested that the state investment board keep that a secret under the exemption for, what is it called? Some sort of proprietary information, like it's trade secrets or something. I'm looking at that situation, and I think it's all accurate. I look at the state investment board, and it seems to me like they are they hired a consultant to hire other consultants. And I have a problem with this kind of across government in North Dakota. It seems like there has been a trend towards what our governing boards do is they just hire consultants to make decisions for them or to tell them what decisions to make, and then they just rubber stamp them. I don't think this is a problem specifically with the state investment board, but it's manifested itself particularly bad with the state investment board. So I guess those two questions to you. First of all, the financial relationship between Callan and these businesses, does that trouble you? And then secondly, also, do you feel like the state investment board is too deferential to their consultants?
Well, first of all, as you did and I did, all of us that grow up in North Dakota and absorb the culture of North Dakota, we all know that everybody's smarter outside our state than inside the state.
Which drives me nuts. A lawmaker made a joke, and he said when they're having committee hearings, the smartest guy in the room or gal in the room is the one in the suit with the briefcase from Minneapolis, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so we kind of grow up with that, and that's the way we are. So we hire all these people from outside, and the reality is. Also, we were talking about $19 billion. Who in North Dakota or what company in North Dakota has the experience and background to say, well, I can manage $19 billion? They don't. So there's some of that. It's not saying they're not capable of doing it, saying they just don't have the background or the credentials to do so.
But that also becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy if you say nobody here can do it, but also you never give anybody a chance here to try it.
And we have thousands of examples of where we have tried it with North Dakotans and they've performed. So we do need to deal with that. But here's in reading the articles, Rob, and wondering about the situation, I'm not in a position to say that Callan did something right or wrong or they're nefarious or whatever the case may be. But I can tell you this, having chaired investment boards and audit committees in public companies myself, one of the things that I know is for the protection of the shareholders. If this is a parallel in the state, it would be our citizens, for the protection of the shareholders, for the protection of proper audit and financial operation materials. You do an RFP, a request for proposal, every 3 years on your managers or your auditors or whatever the case may be. So you don't want to get into these long-term relationships that just like, oh, these guys have always done us well and they bought us dinner a couple of years ago, so we think they're great and just let them do it. We should be renewing these relationships every 3 years or every whatever. There should be some time period where we redo it. It takes some work and it takes some money, but you do it.
There should kind of be a "what have you done for us lately" attitude, right? Like what you did was great in the past, but keep proving yourself, and let's also make sure that there's not somebody out there who couldn't do better.
Do better, yeah, and that happens. Somebody new comes on board and they're better, or they have different experience, whatever the case may be. But it's so easy to get just locked into the routine, renew it every year. You have the contract that says, well, if we don't cancel it within 60 days of the end of the contract, it just continues. All those things are just so you fall into them. They're so easy to happen. And unless you have a real solid structure that says, by the way, every 3 years we're going to put out your contract is 3 years. You're going out with a request for proposal after that, and you can compete with that for that request. But you might make it, you might not. No guarantees.
Do you feel like with the state investment board and specifically because there's a couple of relatively new members on the SIB. One is Insurance Commissioner John Gottfried. He's been around for a while now. And he made some headlines where he had an idea for a state investment program. Proved to be a pretty popular idea because it ended up being introduced as a bill in the legislature, sailed through, was signed into law by Governor Burgum, had broad majority support. You had Democrats supporting it. You had Republicans supporting it. A lot of people thought it was a great idea. Got a lot of resistance from the state investment board, and Mr. Gottfried got a lot of pushback from his fellow board members, and they were upset with him because it was an idea that he announced through his office, through the insurance commissioner's office. He sent out a press release about it, and if you listen to some of the board meetings, they were upset at him for doing that. Another new member, Thomas Beadle, who was just elected treasurer last year, so he's not been on the job that long. He came in, and one of the first things he did is Callan, the organization that we're talking about, they had some accusations of a pay-for-play situation, back in, it was well over a decade ago, going on 2 decades ago. But they had a situation where with the city of San Diego, they were accused of some pay for play. Now, they never acknowledged any wrongdoing, but they did pay a settlement to the city of San Diego. Although as a part of that settlement, the city of San Diego also put out a statement that they don't believe that Callan did any pay for play. But all Treasurer Beadle did was ask the question. And what resulted was a meeting at which the state investment board started saying, well, maybe we shouldn't have these, we should speak with one voice to the media, and we don't want all our different members talking to the media. We want to speak with one voice, and we're only going to have the chair, who's Lieutenant Governor Brent Sanford. We're only going to have him talk about it. I'm hearing that, and I'm saying, gosh, are you guys sending absolutely the wrong message? Where first of all, you're talking about, Thomas Beadle and John Gottfried are statewide elected officials in their own right. And part of their job by law is sitting on the state investment board. So you're going to tell them that they can't talk to the public about what they're doing on the state investment board? They have to filter everything through another elected official, Brent Sanford? I don't know. Some of their moves they're making just left me thinking, what are you guys doing?
So I read a couple articles on it, and I thought, okay, so they really want to be transparent, but they're going to limit the transparency to the communications that come out of the committee. That's not transparent, by the way. But
no.
Here's the reality: John Gottfried, Thomas Beadle, Ed Schafer, Rob Port, Joe Smith, Sally Smith. Anybody in North Dakota has a responsibility and the authority, if they're willing, to make suggestions. The way they can say, you should do this, you should do that. Somebody can sidle up to a legislator at a forum and say, I really think we should have the investment board invest in North Dakota. What's wrong with that? There's nothing wrong with that. And again, it's like, well, who's saying what, or what difference does it make? If it's a good idea, put it forth. If it's a bad idea, shoot it down.
Yeah.
I don't get it. I don't understand the situation. But to me, having members elected, like you say, elected officials making suggestions or inquiries for state activity on behalf of the people of North Dakota, I think is fully appropriate. I think we should have more of it, and I think that the people should be informed of it better.
Also, speaking about Treasurer Beadle, if they want to ask questions, again, I think you have to put the context of him writing that letter to Callan. I think you have to put it in the context of he's relatively new to the job, right? Like he's just getting there, right? So obviously he served in the legislature before, but he now has a seat on the state investment board as a part of his job as treasurer, and he's checking things out, right? He's looking under some rocks to see what he finds. And he said he was satisfied with Callan's answer, and he didn't see anything untoward there. And okay, fine. Why should he be getting blown up for even asking the question? That I don't understand.
One of the skirmishes you always see in the Capitol between elected officials is who's running for governor next. Right. So, somebody puts out a press release, or somebody has a public service announcement with their face on it, asking people to do something, or somebody, they're always jockeying for position. And when somebody, like John Gottfried says, maybe we should invest some portion of our investment funds in the state of North Dakota, somebody's sitting back there and saying, oh, he's just trying to position himself to run for governor.
Yeah.
So you have to take that into consideration.
Sure.
Too.
And that would be fair criticism if he was weighing in on things that had nothing to do. But by law, he has to be on the state investment board. And if that's going to be, of course, somebody who it would make sense if you were campaigning to be insurance commissioner, that part of what you would talk about during your campaign was, gosh, I have some ideas for the state investment board because that's part of my job. That's part of what you're electing me to do, and I have some ideas about it. That's just part of the process. So, it's not like he's weighing in on what's going on in Israel or something. Like he sent out a press release about, well, I think the Israelis ought to do this. Like, it's like, okay, what are you trying to run for next? This was squarely in his job. So I think you and I are in agreement on that. What do you think of the the Forum came out with an editorial, and they said that the legacy fund, and I know that you and I have talked about the legacy fund a little bit, and you said that you kind of wished we hadn't called it the legacy fund because it's given people some maybe grand ideas that are beyond the scope of what the fund was intended. But the Forum said because the legacy fund is a fundamentally different sort of fund, it's not like a pension fund. And I think that's fair. It's not a pension fund. Pension funds are there to serve, we create that as public policy so that we can hire, provide it as a benefit and hire good public workers. The pension fund is a commitment we made to workers, and our goals there is obviously to invest it in a way that allows us to easily make those commitments. And that's a very different thing than the legacy fund that we might want to use for some other purposes, like whether you and I might agree with it, like the in-state investment program. So their argument was the legacy fund needs its own investment board. Do you agree with that?
I don't. I know why does it need a different board? It needs a different board because there's too much money there. It needs a different board because it's a different focus. Here's the reality. It's public money. It's invested in the state. It's a state of North Dakota fund that's invested to get a return. And I think this conversation depends on your view, Rob. If you believe that the legacy fund is set up to put dollars in that will eventually replace the declining dollars from our oil and gas exploration and production, then you want to say, I need to invest those dollars properly, and the prudent investor rule works. If you believe that the bunch of legacy funding projects, or that we should have monuments around the state that are funded by these dollars, then you're going to believe I don't need the prudent investor rule because who cares about that? And the reality is you can't throw out the prudent investor rule because you want to spend a bunch of money on legacy projects, in my opinion. I think the better thing to do is to understand the prudent investor rule and say, we're going to take a portion of our portfolio and we're going to invest it in projects that benefit the long-term careers and jobs and abilities in North Dakota. And by the way, we know that's not going to get enough return to meet our standards in the portfolio. So therefore, we understand that. We're setting aside a portion understanding that. We're going to try to make it up with the other returns on our portfolio. But we still have a responsibility of public dollars here and to get a return on them, because if you just start giving money to somebody, if you start granting money to somebody, if you start just saying, hey, that's a good project, the governor wants to do it or legislative leaders want to do it, you change the dynamics of investing those dollars for the people of North Dakota into the dynamics of saying, oh, somebody says it's a good idea, so we're going to put the money in. I think you need to keep those parameters of the prudent investment rule there, because that gives you the ability to measure against it and say, okay, in this case, we're going to take a lower return, or you know what, we're going to risk and we may not get a return, we might get a loss. But at least you measure it against something instead of willy-nilly someone calling up like the governor and saying, hey, I want to get this done.
Well, I'll tell you, when I heard the idea, my reaction to it was I think you and I disagree a little bit on. I've kind of found myself being pro legacy projects, I guess, and I like the idea because I think we can get some return. It's not going to necessarily be the return on the direct return on interest paid on the investment from the legacy fund. I think we can get a return from diversifying our economy and creating some opportunities and making capital available, to do a lot of the things that we have really struggled to do as a state since statehood. I don't think there's a silver bullet that solves the problem. I think it can help, and I think there's returns there that could be. But that debate aside, I didn't like it because I'm thinking, oh my God, another board, another commission. We already have so many that are meeting and doing things. We don't have enough reporters to cover them all, which is why they really say some crazy things in some of these meetings sometimes. There's so many of them. I don't know that I want another one, But this brings me to another question. Some of the discussion on the state investment board is where they're saying, well, do we have the right personnel on this board, right? Like, why is the insurance commissioner here, right? Is he the right person to have on this? Also, are we working some of these? I mean, in North Dakota, we really like to work our elected officials hard, right? I mean, people may joke about that, but we task them with sitting on a lot of boards and doing a lot of extra things. Is it too much to where, maybe this gets back to the problem of them being too deferential to their consultants, but do they have enough time and enough bandwidth to provide the sort of oversight that we expect when we're tasking them with these jobs?
I think it's a misconception of what a board does. If you say, "Oh, gee, we need a separate board," your concept is the other boards are too much, or they're distracted, or they've got different visions, or whatever the case may be, and you don't understand that the board. You don't put people on the board to bring their pencils and erasers to figure out what to do. You bring people on the board to put the proper people in place. Let those people know where you want them to go, and then you let them do it. And it's it isn't that the board does the work; it's the board designs and puts in place the work that gets to be done. And in this case, and let me go back to one thing. A separate board, in my opinion, will totally get you in trouble, because what you'll be set up to do is it'll be set up for a board to have the authority to make these decisions. And here's what happens. And when I was at USDA, of course, we had the Rural Development Fund, and the Rural Development Fund was billions of dollars. And so that money gets distributed throughout the United States of America. And as appropriate projects with the right returns and the things come to bear, you fund them. At some point in time, all those projects that are out there are funded. There are always more. I had senators pound on my desk and say, "I want this funded. It's in my state, and I want it to happen." And go like, "The thing doesn't even cash flow. It doesn't even meet the parameters. Why would you do that? I want it done." And so you have to be so careful to say, we're not going to go out and find projects. We're not going to go out and politically do projects. We're not going to go out and do good projects because they sound good. We need to keep a fence around these dollars with clear, precise ways to invest it for the good of North Dakota. And if you start saying, "Well, I want different people to sit on the board because they will be more persuaded by the powers that be, or they're more persuaded. They don't care about return on investment. They care about jobs in their community." Okay, those are honest arguments. But if you don't have the pole, if you will, that you've planted, that you can swing around and say, "Here's what we're supposed to do." Now, in this case, jobs in this community are going to have a long-term effect, and the return is going to be outside the parameters of the investment, but the return is going to be huge for the state. Then you purposefully make that decision. You don't do it because some senator called you, or the governor called you, or your mother-in-law called you. You do it because you said, under these conditions, we're going to deviate from that parameter because it's important. It's purposeful. It's smart. It should be done.
Yeah.
But if you take away the parameters, it just gets messy.
And that is the risk of something like the in-state investment program, where it's you're kind of opening it up to I want to say politics, but people use that pejoratively, because I guess I have a very broad view of politics. It's the means by which we govern. So it's not just politics. Everything's political. But specifically populism, where for instance, and I don't mean to dog on the idea out of Jamestown, because I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea, but the idea of this amusement park in Jamestown, and they were talking about maybe wanting an investment from the legacy fund, and I want that investment to happen if they come and they have a good business plan and it's going to meet parameters where we're not just giving them a lollipop, right? I want it to be a good idea and a good business venture, That's obviously could if it's successful pay dividends for the Jamestown and the region and the state. But I don't want it to be a lollipop because some influential lawmakers or some influential political people from Jamestown, whispered in the right ears. I think that's the danger you run with something like the in-state investment program. And we should talk about it. As somebody who supports that, I want it to be out in the open that that's a possibility, that sort of thing can happen. Let's be cognizant of it and let's avoid it, because at the end of the day, they still need to be good investments and meet the parameters, which I think were prudently written into House Bill 1425, and meet those things. So I think populism, Ed, as anybody who's read my stuff lately, has been on my mind a lot. So maybe I'm seeing it everywhere now, but it seems like every level of government we traditionally have put in place protections to sort of isolate policymaking from sort of the whims of the populace, because the public can be fickle and very changeable, and whereas policy can't be. And so, I think we've got to be very careful about protecting these things from that.
Theodore Roosevelt had a saying that I always have appreciated. He said, when he was president, he said, I'm not here to represent public opinion. I'm here to represent the public. And there's a vast difference between the two.
Yeah.
And, and that's prescient for today. Public opinion, if the Frost Fire project in eastern North Dakota, didn't get funded or did get funded, and somebody's mad and they go, break into the restaurant with signs saying our senator's awful.
Right.
It's you just can't operate that way, and that's why I say do not change the rules. Don't take away the parameters. Yeah. Don't change the investment criteria. Use them to measure responsible decision-making processes that may deviate. But if you do it purposefully, and you do it reasonably, and you say, this is why we did it, and you have a way to measure it.
Are you we only have a few minutes left with you, but have you been following the reorganization process at all for the North Dakota Republican Party? Chairman Berg's not going to be running for another term as chairman. I think Perry Schafer from Mandan is running. Another gentleman named Robert Wheeler is running for chair. Obviously, we came through a very tumultuous, and you and I talked about this before, a very tumultuous reorganization season. Which it sounds like we may get to do all over again next year, thanks to redistricting. So we'll get to do all that again. I don't know if it'll be the same way, because I think the stakes will be a little bit lower. But what are you seeing? Because that's coming up this weekend. The reorg in Medora. So what are you seeing as kind of a elder statesman in the party?
Well, I wish I could be there. That's what I see. It's going to be very interesting. We have all kinds of factions in the party. And people are censuring legislators because they didn't vote the way they wanted them to vote or whatever. And I've said it a million times around here, but I think our Republican Party has gotten away from doing what we think is policy-wise directional for the people. We've just gotten away from saying we should tell the people what to do, or we should do what I want to do. And if you don't do what I want to do, then you're wrong, and then I'm going to censor you or badmouth you or get a Facebook page and beat you up or whatever.
Be careful, because you and I just got done criticizing populism. So
yeah. But the reality is, populism is great if it's two things. Populism is really great to get information in front of the decision-making bodies. Falling to populism, being afraid of populism, being directed by populism is not good. If politicians don't have the strength to stand against what might be popular opinion and may not be right, they can't be there. Most of them don't. And today, especially, how do you react to that when you've got the anonymous postings on media saying all the things and this and that? It's almost impossible to stand against that populism. But anyway, back to the party. I think it could be chaos, and I think it could be smooth. And I think it's going to depend on the how big and how strong that Chairman Berg is going to be willing to use that gavel. Because we have rules, we have bylaws, we have direction for those things, for how resolutions are put forth, how people vote, who can vote. That's all there. I think that the transfer of the chair from Chairman Berg to whomever the next chair is going to be happens at the end of the meeting, not the beginning. So it's going to be Chairman Berg's shoulders that this falls on. And I think he has the capability to drive this process through while there'll be bumps. I think he has the ability to drive this process through to get to the end and have a good product for the direction of the Republican Party.
Do you feel, how does the Republican Party continue to hold itself together? The current Republican dominance has its roots, obviously, in you getting yourself elected governor. From there, it's been, a pretty steady. I mean, obviously some ups and downs, but I think on a long enough timeline, the trend has been up to the point where it's. I mean, how could the party possibly be, much more successful? I mean, there's a handful of legislative seats, I guess, that they could have 100% Republican legislature, which honestly I'm not even sure would be a good thing. How does the party continue to govern and hold itself together in this environment? Because I think that's a lot of the challenge right now is the Democrats just in most of the state just aren't a threat. And so, I think in that environment you have Republicans who can become a little bit decadent, right? And forget a little bit what their job is, which I think, people ask me all the time, why are Republicans so successful in North Dakota? And it's not just because the voters here are organically Republican and they're just going to vote for every Republican on the ballot. As we know, they'll vote for the right Democrats. I think it has its roots in the fact that the Republican Party, although we could quibble here and there, has governed well, has governed moderately, and that's why they keep winning one election after another. And what I'm afraid of is that, in the absence of any real threat from the left, that we're gonna lose track of that duty to govern moderately. Does that make sense?
Well, I think it does make sense, and I'm concerned about it because I think with the factions in the party, with the things that are said and done and proposed, we'll start losing elections. The reality is people in North Dakota have been voting for Republican leaders because they believe in the direction of government that's put forth, and they have learned to know and trust Republican leaders and Republican principles. And I think the answer, Joel, Rob, is we need to.
You just call me Joel?
Sorry, no, I said I stopped halfway through.
Oh my! Oh
God,
boy,
that was awful.
That's not that bad.
That was awful. Anyway, I think the answer is Republicans have to rally around core values. If we want to talk about social issues and who's right and who's wrong and who's going to play basketball and who isn't and all those kinds of things, that's great. That is how public discourse, you develop public policy. But the reality is we have core values in the Republican Party of having government not do more than you're capable of doing for yourself, a long-term view on how things go in, fiscal conservatism. Though there are a handful of core values that I think the party has to identify and commit to, and have our candidates commit to, so that people know what we stand for and know how we're going to direct the governance of the state, so that they know what's going on. That's why are we in there? Why are we doing it? Why do we want to be elected? We want to be elected because of these core values, not because I have a personal vendetta against some social issue. What are our core values? What do they stand for? Well, we stand on them. That's how we get elected, and I think that's where the party needs to go back to.
Ed, thank you so much for your time, as always. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you, Rob. It's great to be with you, and thanks for the opportunity.